Reagan that said, "We will be a party of bold colors, not pastels." And yet there are millions of people that feel like strangers in their own party. So much for bold colors. So much for principle. I guess they can take some consolation in the fact that they did something tonight by once again compromising, by once again reaching across the aisle, by once again abandoning the conservative movement.
Well, what happened this week in Mississippi still has Tea Party pots boiling and members fuming over their runoff defeat to Thad Cochran. Charges of racism, using African-American voters for something other than morally correct purposes. And that brings us to this most vexing question over the butting of heads between two factions that, at their core, you would think should be working together for political gain. Welcome into Midpoint. Managing editor of the Washington Spectator, John Stoehr, joins us today on the show. John, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's get right down to it then. McDaniel says that it was an abandonment of conservative values, the way that the Mississippi primary was won. Was he right?
Well, maybe if you consider that the Tea Party is losing. I mean, it is losing. You know, it is losing. You know, some candidates are not getting where they want to be, but they certainly are putting a lot of pressure on the Republican Party as a national party. So, you know, in terms of how you, it depends on how you define losing and compromising.
All right, let's go ahead and talk about that compromise then, because
Sure.
This is a line of discussion that I think we've been having here on Midpoint and on the Newsmax network for some time, but it never seems to quite get down to the answers. They always change as everything changes on the political landscape, as it always does. You have basically one party. You have a Republican Party that is sitting here that wants to defeat the Democrats. I hate to make this politics 101, but for some people it seems to work the best.
Right.
You then have a Tea Party facet. You have, let's call them the old guard, the standard guard, if you will. It would seem to me, and anybody with any sort of logic, that if these sides are going to be successful in the long term, perhaps in the short term, they can do it without it, but to be successful in the long term, they are going to have to put these two sides together, and they are going to have to embrace each other. Mm-hmm. Difficult to say. Which side is more likely to not want to be embraced? The old guard Republicans by the Tea Party, or the Tea Party by the old guard Republicans?
I would say the Tea Party doesn't want to be embraced because these are the people who, you know, believe in principle. That this is not to say that, you know, establishment Republicans don't have any principles, but they're not very political animals, is really what I'm saying. The Tea Party, people like McDaniel, he doesn't seem to understand that what he says he has to get voters. He has to get people to vote for him. Cochran knew how to do that, and so Cochran wasn't in a position where he had to embrace the principles of the Tea Party. You know, note that he didn't go to the right of McDaniel. He basically softened his image. In fact, the Center for Public Integrity ran a report this week showing that a lot of the money spent on Cochran's campaign was to basically was showering television sets across Mississippi with sunshine and daisies, showing how great Cochran was and what he's done for the state. He didn't go negative, he went positive. So I think in terms of to answer your question, who is not willing to be embraced, is probably the people McDaniel speaks for. Unless the Tea Party people, you know, start finding better candidates. I think the people who fund the Tea Party are political animals. They understand what needs to be done. I think they just, in many ways, they just need to find better candidates. All
right, let's go ahead. You hit those two words, and I caught those right away. Better candidates. What
Right.
then, in a Tea Party perspective, would make a better candidate, and what are they getting wrong?
Well, I think you could look at a good somebody like David Bratt. You know, over in Virginia, David Bratt was the underdog who beat the majority leader, Eric Cantor, and apparently nobody saw that coming. David Bratt ran on an anti-elite, anti-corporate, anti-crony capitalism platform, and that got a lot of people's attention. And that actually appeals to a great number of people, right, left, and center. In fact, a lot of lefties are talking about crony capitalism just as much as the Tea Party people are. I think one of McDaniel's biggest problems was when he started talking about observers at the polls, and that is taken in a place like Mississippi. That's taken to be code for we're watching out for black people, and so when you send a message out like that, you're basically inviting people to come and vote against you. People who have no other reason to vote may just come out to vote against you, especially Democrats who are black and usually don't have anything to say about Republican primaries. So that was, a dumb thing to do. And so, that's one of the first things you should think about when you go out to find better candidates.
I want the folks here to hear, this is an ad that we have. This is an ad that played the Democratic ad going after the GOP to basically help the Tea Party. And this talks about a lot of the races around the country right now, these different races. Let's see that.
Don't you get mad when politicians tax and spend you to death? Then get angry at Tom MacArthur. As a Randolph Town Councilman, MacArthur raised property taxes every single year. Every single year. MacArthur raised property taxes 12% in 3 years, and spending increased every year he was in office. Tom MacArthur, higher taxes, higher spending. Say no to Tom MacArthur. Patriot Majority USA is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
Of course, we've seen political ads for generations here. We're going to continue to see them right now. Is it smart then, in your opinion, strategy-wise, for the Democrats to go after the Tea Partyists instead of going after the overall Republican candidates themselves, that old guard, if you will?
Well, it's certainly good Democratic strategy to characterize your opponent party in terms of their most extreme wing. That's always very, that's very smart strategy, even if it's not true. You should definitely focus on that. And in terms of that commercial, the idea that anti-tax is always a good idea from the Republican point of view. Being anti-tax is always great. What's interesting is the guy like David Bratt. He was anti-tax, anti-regulation, but he was also anti-business, and that says a lot in relation to Thad Cochran. I hope I'm not getting too labyrinthine here, but Cochran was basically like, I'm the establishment guy. I do bring federal dollars here. I am not concerned about the national debt, and you're going to vote for me, and people then did. So there is. These two elections, this was last Tuesday and this past Tuesday, really highlight the central tensions right now, I think, in the Republican Party.
One thing that I saw, a couple of minutes we have left, that caught my attention with regard to this. Recent article that came out of the Chicago Tribune, and the headline, it said, Republicans need a reasonable hero for 2016. Reasonable hero. All right, so do they have a reasonable hero at this point? Because it would seem to many people they simply don't have that quite locked in just yet, and we're still searching for that reason.
Oh, yeah. They don't, but they do. I mean, it may not be apparent. Right now, a lot of the establishment Republicans are looking at Jeb Bush, but Jeb Bush is really an allergy to a lot of conservative, real conservative, constitutional conservative Republicans. The people like McDaniel, they don't like the Bush name because basically Bush, George W. Bush was into nation building and spending, and the national debt be damned. Excuse me. But I think the Republican Party has some really viable candidates, and I don't mean people like Chris Christie. I mean Rand Paul. Rand Paul, he appeals across the ideological spectrum. He's got impeccable conservative bona fides, thanks to his record and also his father. But he also appeals a lot to Democrats who are not really into the idea of the federal government spying on them, not really into the idea of nation building abroad either. They're tired of war. the anti-war crowd really listens to Rand Paul, and it doesn't hurt that Rand Paul seems to be agnostic about things like gay marriage and the legalization of marijuana.
And there is that reasonableness that we have been talking about. We're all out of time, unfortunately.
Okay.
John Stoehr, the managing editor, Washington Spectator. John, thanks so much for joining us. We'll come back. We'll visit again.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend. Now, that's an interesting thing. If you're a Republican or if you're a member of the Tea Party, who is that reasonable candidate? Tell us who you think that might be, because we're listening to all these names, but who do you think is reasonable? All right, coming up, no more dangerous place in the world than inside the Beltway. That and more as we continue right here on Midpoint, where we question everything.